All right, and sound check. I'm assuming, Worcester, we're all good to go. As good as it gets. Like to try to get through as much as Module 2, and same old. If we get close, that'll be good enough. We certainly should have enough time. And again, my intent is to try like crazy to get through Modules 2 and 3 by Wednesday at noon, and Friday we won't need that block of time is the hope. So we'll see how we do. So moving on, this last section is now discussing a little bit much more up close and personal the different segments of the nephron and how it handles sodium. We've talked, in all this, sodium's the big player in signaling. Sodium's telling you, the health of the filtration, the health of the nephron itself, and obviously the health of your body too to some degree. So we'll talk about that through each segment. We'll talk a little bit about managing water balance through here. Not going to get too in-depth at all about concentration other than the generic pattern through the nephron itself. And then again, we'll kind of dip into a few other areas briefly. But starting out terminology, reabsorption, just referring to pulling back into the bloodstream. Something's been dumped out, and it's now being pulled back into the bloodstream. Secretion, though, we've talked about filtration going on. Some secretion does occur throughout that whole nephron. So anything from meds in the PCT to other things down this line as far as hydrogen and potassium and things further down the line as far as maintaining some of those balances occur in the DCT and collecting duct. PCT, as we said, that first chunk, I've said it before, reabsorption, pull back, lots of big numbers, anything from 60s to 90s as far as whatever the content is being talked about. The big one you'll really be following, essentially, as a little precursor, about 65% of it gets pulled back in the PCT, another 25% on the upgoing or ascending loop of that loop of Henle, and then say another 5%, give or take, in the early part of the DC, and then a very small percent, 1, 2, or 3%, is that final fine-tuning. But we're going to talk about the mechanisms at each level. They're all a little bit different. And that's really each one of those at the sites of your different diuretics, if you think about it. Urea, we aren't going to chat about too much other than giving it a token discussion as, that's kind of the player as far as maintaining those concentration gradients. But in the PCT, half of it's, pulled back, and then later on in the later half of the nephron is where those balances occur. But everything else lumped into the others, if you will, a good, 95%, 99%, big numbers, majority of it in a healthy nephron, a healthy PCT, should pull it all back into the bloodstream. Glucose, it really just depends. We'll briefly talk about it, but if you think about it, the ability for that PCT to pull it back to meet the supply and demand. So when you get to that glucose dumping level, it just can't, keep pace, if you will. Next thing you know, you've got glucose in the urine. But anyways, back to our discussion as far as sodium. What we're going to look at with sodium through the PCT, the loop of Henle, and the DCT are the transport mechanisms in a generic way. We aren't going too far into any of the biochemistry or co-transports, et cetera, but enough to be able to connect the dots with your mechanism of action as far as some of the hows and whys. Some of your diuretics may promote, acidosis, or may promote different potassium levels in the blood as secondary effects. So as far as glucose, sodium getting into the PCT cell. Here's the aluminum of that nephron. Here's the cell wall of the PCT itself, and over here is your bloodstream. So essentially, as sodium's put in there, it makes its way across that wall through co-transport mechanisms. Glucose is a classic, but others as well. And this co-transport mechanism pushes it into the interstitium or within the cell itself. Obviously, gradient is an issue. So to have the right gradient, you do need an active transport. You do need ATP. So you need life. You need a healthy cell doing what it should be. And so this sodium-potassium pump up here should be creating or actively, maintaining that gradient to allow the reabsorption to occur. So that's step number one as far as getting sodium from the lumen into the bloodstream, if you will. But the other version, and it's really the same thing, it's just co-transport, it's just what it co-transports with, is the mechanism as far as hydrogen and also bicarbonate as far as its reabsorption going on. If you think about it, as you push bicarb into, it gets filtered, and you want to maintain healthy values to maintain acid-base balances. So as we said, you want 90 whatever % of it to be reabsorbed in this PCT. So the mechanism in place for that to occur is through this whole co-transport, if you will, and simply using the whole buffering mechanism of carbonic anhydrase, taking the bicarbonate, taking the hydrogen, converting it to carbonic acid, and then converting it into H2O and CO2, which then can be taken up by the cell. So you have this mechanism in place. It's really helping to absorb bicarbonate. Meanwhile, it also takes in a sodium, but it's also pushing out a hydrogen. But the nice thing, and this is a better visual of that mechanism up here. So here's the PCT, cell, there's the lumen, and here's our bloodstream. And this carbonic anhydrase system, which is just your standard buffering mechanism throughout the body, as it co-transports, so as you throw a hydrogen out into the lumen to be able to create the carbonic acid and then allow the CO2 and H2O to get into the cell and absorb that bicarbonate is really what it's doing. Once it's in the cell, carbonic acid disassociates it, the bicarbonate makes its way into the bloodstream, so mission accomplished, reabsorb bicarbonate, and it just recycles the hydrogen ion. So in a neat way, what you're really doing is absorbing bicarbonate, but you're not adding, hydrogen here and changing acidic values. It's kind of a recycling mechanism. The only caveat with that is you do have hydrogens coming in from the bloodstream here, so if this gradient is pushing a lot, then, yes, you would be, excreting more hydrogen out into the nephron. But the take-home message is sodium, PCT, it's a co-transport with glucose and other things, and also co-transport as far as hydrogen exchange, but that's part of a secondary system involving reabsorbing bicarbonate and recycling those hydrogens so you don't get a huge change in acidic values. So diuretic number one, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors that you've chatted about and talked all the pros and cons. This is the site of action as far as its function. So what you're doing is stopping that cycle that we had talked about, so you're inhibiting the sodium uptake. So there's its action or mechanism of action, if you will. The only caveat, obviously, you can affect your acid-base balance because now you're affecting your bicarb reabsorption and your hydrogen excretion. So you've got some potential changes that way. So this slide, I'm not sure where I stole it, but you'll see plenty of these if you were to see it. Maybe you've got them. But really, as you look at the nephron, here's the PCT, loop of Henle, DCT, and then the distal DCT. Just identifying the sites of actions for each of these diuretics, and as I said, their action on each of these transport mechanisms for sodium is really what they're affecting. So that's PCT. I think that's the take-home message there as far as some discussion. Again, this slide is just reinforcing what I said in the beginning. Obviously, you need ATP, energy, and active, happy, healthy cell to create the gradients in the first place for those things to occur. This is just another artist's rendition, just kind of giving you a visual of the co-transport of sodium as it's hooked up with glucose, et cetera. Over here, it's hooked up with hydrogen excretion as part of that whole recycling mechanism for bicarbonate. So when you're not studying, when your brain's not worried about a test, come back and kind of follow the pathway through each of these. So glucose, not too much to say here. I think we're pretty up to speed as far as numbers and everything else. The only thing I'm just going to add to it is appreciate that there are some special carriers, and that's about the extent I'm really going to take this, other than a reminder of where the thresholds are for dumping. But as we said, the co-transport for sodium and glucose, there's these special subcarriers that are identified. And if you're looking in the diabetic world or glucose world of kidney function and intervention, the research is talking about these different carriers. And on both ends, this is on the get it into the PCT cell, and there's different subversions of these. Same thing over here, these GLUT carriers too as well. There's different subsets and different discussions how to modify those or go after those pharmaceutically or medically, if you will. But the point is, co-transport to get in, once it gets in, it's really a passive diffusion as long as the appropriate carriers are there to encourage that to occur. So that's the extent of the mechanism, if you will. This is nothing more than reiterating our discussion about that I think we talked about in endocrine as far as where those thresholds are, and clinically I think everybody's up to speed too as well, as far as what this is really telling you is when you reach transport maximum, you've reached that co-transport mechanism maximum. Those carriers can't go any faster. So once you get to that 350 kind of value, it just can't do any better. That's as good as it gets. But the flip side is, too, if you have PCT damage or pathology, toxicity or something, you're also inhibiting those mechanisms, too, as well. So, as usual, a cascade of events. So just go back, make sure you're good as far as the different numbers. We talked about where it maxes out. It can't go any faster. But we also, on the front end of things, as, glucose values go up, where does it, it filters in, but it can filter out. Where does that price point break, if you will? And that's that standard 180, 200 that, we've talked about, and I think everybody's familiar with right along. Just again, as I said, make sure the front end, you're good with the thresholds, and also on the other end as far as transport maximum. All right, so that's absorption. As I said, we aren't going into every little nuance of every thing that's being reabsorbed. Really, we're just focusing on sodium through this discussion. Getting to secretion on the other end of things, I just would highlight, as we said, the hydrogen and some other functions, creatinine, things like that, are being pushed through, so it's not a total, reabsorption state. But the pharmaceutical issue is this is a site for some meds, and I don't know how much in pharmacy it gets broken down and talked about. I don't think I could expand on it too much, other than appreciating this is a site for some of that metabolism of breakdown and excreting different pharmaceuticals. So again, obviously with kidney disease and you're treating something else, you've got a whole issue of toxicity and juggling match. All right, so that's the PCT, front end, reabsorption. two mechanisms for sodium as far as getting it in. And again, site of our first diuretic carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. Loop of Henle. I always smile at this. And it was politely, you guys, I get an A+ award for professional behavior. It's, I stand up here and go through all my typos and all that stuff. I think I was saying choroid process the other day with choroid. And it was politely pointed out. One year I sat up here and did, I think, this whole renal thing, but until the end of the slide, talking about loop of Henle. So I look at it with fond memory of my, synaptic gaps up here. But anyways, so we'll get it straight. Loop of Henle, though. Thing to look at here. Remember, we've got two sets of descending loops. You had those juxtaglomerular ones, a good 10-15% that get down into the medulla, and their job is concentration. So that's really what I'm referring to here as far as function goes. And so we're discussing the role as far as sodium, but we're also discussing now a little bit about concentration dilution that's going on with these big loops that go down. And the way they accomplish it are with the descending and the ascending portions have different characteristics of that wall. They're permeable to one thing, meanwhile the other one's permeable to other things, which the net effect is to create these concentrations that we're chatting about. But before I get to the concentration piece, I'm going to continue the whole sodium pathway, how on earth it gets reabsorbed. 65% PCT, another 25% in this loop of Henle, and not only just in the loop, but in the ascending portion. It's in the big, thick portion back here is where all of this sodium reabsorption is occurring. So there's no sodium, exchange going on as that loop, that thin segment goes down into the medulla, if you will. So how does it happen here? A little bit different, same analogy though, a whole co-transport mechanism. So sodium, potassium, chloride, the big three, has this co-transporter that gets it across the membrane into the cell. And then once in, again, same thing, you need the active transport helping with the gradient, within the cell and eventually pushing it into the bloodstream. Potassium, chloride make their own way to diffuse in. So similar as far as needing co-transport, but the moral of the story is, again, when you're starting to throw some diuretics at it and blocking your sodium, you're affecting other things. And so this is really the basis as to why these why you get your secondary effects of the different diuretics. And I'm not sure why. In fact, I think I will. I'll probably get myself screwed up here, but I'll do it. I think it makes more sense to talk about the diuretic piece of it and then go back to the concentration piece. So I'm just skipping through these three slides. So if I throw something to block that co-transport mechanism, so quote unquote your loop diuretics, that's where they're acting and blocking this pathway to some degree. So if you think about it, it's got the potential, there's good 25%, so it can be very voluminous, if you will, towards blocking sodium getting back into the bloodstream. But the caveat, though, is you're hooked up with potassium, so if you're blocking the sodium reabsorption, you're also affecting potassium as well, and calcium. Calcium gradients are dependent on this co-transport mechanism too as well. So if you shut this down, really you're altering those gradients. So again, not sure if you memorized your secondary effects of the different meds, but again, this is the basis for it. The hypokalemia, though, locally occurs, but something else also happens, and this is the ghost of nephron future here. In the distal end of this nephron, you have an exchange that goes on with sodium uptake and potassium secretion. And so if you're not getting rid of sodium, if you're blocking it, essentially what you're doing is pushing more sodium into the end of this nephron. So that mechanism, that aldosterone mechanism that's pulling sodium back, that's cranked up. And so if you're pulling back more sodium at the very end of this nephron, the exchanges pull back more sodium, excrete more potassium, and that too is where you can get your hypokalemia as far as a secondary effect or disrupting the cart, if you will. So that's loop diuretics, and that's the transport mechanism in this loop of Van Lane. But I did want to briefly go back and then kind of talk a little generically about the diluting pathway, if you will. And at the very end of this module, we've got some numbers attached to this, so I'll briefly start to throw them out. But as the concentration winds through the Bowman's capsule and into the PCT, as it starts down this loop of handling, it starts out at a number of around, say, 300-ish, if you will. By the time it gets to the bottom of the loop, you're talking a concentration of around, say, 1,200. So you're really ratcheting up, concentrating like crazy, all the way down to the bottom of this thing. And the way you accomplish it is the descending limb is permeable to water. Sodium stays in there, so you've got all your concentration building up, and you're just pulling out water all the way down until you get to this as concentrated as it gets on the bottom of this thing. Then when you turn the corner and you go back up, you're going to make your way back and eventually get to the DCT and eventually out the collecting duct. And as you go back up, what happens is all of a sudden you can't take out any more water, so that ascending limb isn't permeable to water, but what it is permeable to is what we just yacked about with the sodium transport mechanism. So you're pulling out sodium. So all the way up, as that sodium co-transport's going on, you're also diluting the fluid in that tubule till eventually you get that you've diluted it even more than what it was when it came in. So you get to numbers like 100 or 150 or so. So you start out at 300, bottom of the loop 1,200, dilute it like crazy with your sodium pulling everything out, and then you get into numbers of 100 to 150. And then the final job of that DCT and collecting duct is to then fine-tune where you want your concentration to be with it. So it starts with it, super dilute, and it can make it as concentrated or as dilute as, whatever your body's physiology is asking for. So that's what you'll see, as I said at the very end of this. I kind of did a little recipe of the numbers through start to finish, but this is typically what you'll see, that 300. The take-home message is the wall is permeable to water only on descending, permeable only to the sodium, and impermeable to water on the ascending. So that's the mechanism in a kind of simplistic discussion of how the concentration piece of all this works. Again, this was, kind of jumping back and forth as I had kind of skipped ahead, but this was just giving you the visual to give you some of the basis for the potassium values, but also that gradient value that goes along as you alter sodium uptake too, so the potential for calcium to decrease. All right, so now we've made our way through PCT, done the loop of Henle, and now we're getting to that point where the macula densa, those specialized cells, are sitting at the top of that thing, and from that point distal is the distal collecting or distal convoluted tubule, DCT. So if you think about it too, 65%, 25%, and then you got the sensor mechanism. So what that's really saying is the nephron functioning the way it should for sodium reabsorption, and if you got some sensor feedbacks now as this macula densa to kind of do all its auto control or talk to the big picture of the body's physiology, but it makes sense they kind of sit there in this whole cycle. But the DCT split up into kind of two functional regions, and really it's kind of based on how much dilution's going on. In other words, that story of continuing to dilute continues in the DCT, so that fluid is continuing to become more dilute, and then eventually in the late DCT / collecting duct, functionally they kind of act the same and do the same. That's when you start to get on the business of concentrating to the urine of whatever it needs to be, if you will. So the early segment, a little discussion again, how it handles sodium. We've done, what, 65, 25. I think we got another 5% to go as far as numbers. So you still are managing it. You do have a sodium chloride transport mechanism pulling this thing in with the same story of an active transport on the other side. So this mechanism is really just the basis of getting sodium back into the bloodstream through this early DCT, if you will. Again, I've just given you plenty of visuals to help kind of support that as far as it goes. But the bottom line is, if I can sneak ahead to it, is again your third classification of your diuretics, your thiazides, as far as they're acting on that transport mechanism and blocking it. Again, you think, I don't know, clinically, you'd probably speak to it better, but, here you've got a smaller amount, 5% potential. Volume-wise, you can't, block that much sodium, so to speak, but it certainly is effective of what you're trying to accomplish. So that might be the basis of why, this combined with the potassium sparing is chosen. But, I'm way out of my, comfort zone as far as giving you any clinical reasoning to the different approaches. So the thiazides act on that transport mechanism. As we said, it's this calcium often is dependent on the gradient flow of sodium. So as far as some of the changes, you may see alterations as far as calcium values, but then you come down here and that whole story with kalemia or potassium values in the blood, and that's the real one, is if you're not reabsorbing in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, if you're not reabsorbing in this early DCT, then you're pushing more sodium for the last phase of reabsorption, and that thing's going at the speed of light, and when that's going at the speed of light, it's pushing out a lot of potassium, and that's the basis for getting to your potassium, your low blood values as far as potassium. We haven't got there yet, and that's really what next week is, but also the whole acid-base issue. Sodium, potassium do some exchange, and also your hydrogen and sodium as well at the very end of this DCT collecting duct. So not only are you affecting potassium levels when you ratchet up that system, you're potentially affecting your acid-base balance and pushing out too many hydrogens as well. So that whole issue of potassium-sparing diuretic, that's really just operating at that, that mechanism I keep referring to in the late DCT. So again, I think same old, just another picture saying the same thing. So that's the early DCT, continuing to dilute, continuing to pull back sodium, if you will. Now, last but not least, we're getting into this late DCT / collecting duct. Functionally, they're doing the same thing. They're involved in concentrating. They're involved in fine-tuning your sodium. They're involved in fine-tuning your fluid, and they're involved in fine-tuning your acid-base balances along the way. So if you think about it, again, it's kind of like your GI tract too. Most of it goes on small intestine, but the large intestine gets all the media for kind of the fine-tuning of your fluid and reabsorption, et cetera. So in this DCT, late DCT, there's two types of cells, principal cell, alpha cell. And in the principal cell is this whole mechanism we just were chatting about with the sodium-potassium exchange. And so their job, for every sodium they pull back into the bloodstream, they're pushing out potassium into the nephron, the lumen. So this is the basis, as we said, if you've blocked your sodium reabsorption in the PCT, loop of Henle, or in the early DCT, anywhere along the line, you're potentially increasing the amount of sodium that's landing in this late DCT area. So those cells are sensing that, and it's increasing this gradient to reabsorb sodium and to push out more potassium. And so that's that basis, again, for that hypokalemia that may be associated with earlier on diuretics, if you will. This also is the mechanism that aldosterone works at. We gave it some lip service about what does aldosterone do. It tells the kidneys not to push out as much sodium and encourages it to exchange, or to reabsorb. So aldosterone is very pro make this co-transport happen. So that's why those, potassium sparing are really aldosterone inhibiting type mechanisms, if you will. So this is the site as far as aldosterone, late DCT, collecting duct, principal cell, and blocking this sodium-potassium exchange, or encouraging the sodium-potassium exchange. Meanwhile, another type of cell, again, still the co-transported sodium. It's connected up, and similar to way back in the beginning of all this with the PCT, is involved in co-transport and exchange with the hydrogen ions. So now this is where your acid base can be affected. So in other words, we made the comment, those diuretics can cause hypokalemia from secreting too much potassium. Well, the same things occurring is you're secreting too much, hydrogen. So that's why you're, winding up with this diagnosis of metabolic alkalosis, if you will. So that's the connection. Not going to chat too much about this other than appreciate at this alpha cell, these guys is the site of that whole issue of reabsorbing and secreting bicarbonate and their hydrogen ions in the effort to balance your acid-base equilibrium. Module 3, we're going to do our acid-base, and we'll come back and revisit this discussion. So just put it on the generic burner that at this point it's the alpha cells. And under normal circumstances, as those hydrogen ions are excreted, the acidity of the urine has to be buffered to some degree, and it does it simply through phosphate and ammonia buffers, and each one has its pros and cons of how well it works at different urine acidities, if you will. But at this point, just appreciate this is the site of mechanism. That's how the connection occurs with your diuretics, and also this is a potential for what's going on with your renal compensation, if you will, as far as acid-base balance. All right. So again, I think this I've already identified the discussion as far as aldosterone and the principal cells. The last discussion is that site is the piece where those potassium-sparing diuretics occur. And again, it kind of makes sense often when it's, piggybacked or combined and done the pharmaceutical cocktail of, doing them together. And the effort is to maintain or minimize that potassium balance along the way. Volume-wise, too, again, you're talking 1, 2, 3% of sodium. So by this point, it's not much. It's just a very fine-tuning to make sure your body's equilibrium's happy and you're getting rid of what you should. So that's an overview. As I said, again, I'm just gave you the visual to show you how they're antagonists. Really, they're just doing the opposite of aldosterone. All right, plenty of different versions out there. Not sure what you had pharmaceutically. I hope this reinforces. I hope I'm not just reinventing the wheel or being redundant to you. But it should just give you a better basis of the clinical reasoning, or the reason for the clinical reasoning that goes on with some of the strategies with diuretics. So this next slide, I'm not going to be chasing you on the specifics of the slide. I'm just it's kind of a nice summary slide to some degree as far as the site of actions for each of those. It really it isn't anything different than we've chatted about, but the take-home message is recognize the mechanism of transport and recognize the effect of the diuretic at each level and how much sodium is being reabsorbed potentially for each. All right, let's see, peeking at a little bit about water as far as what's going on and connecting the dots here. Remember, we got the synergistic action of aldosterone acting on those principal cells. Well, we also have to get the water to go with it too, and we talked about ADH. What's it do? It makes the kidney more permeable to water, and this is the site of action too as well. So the ADH acts on those guys to synergistically pull more fluid, more sodium. Well, pull more sodium, fluid will follow, increase BP and blood volume. All right, not sure, looks like I got ahead of myself on these slides, so I think I've already addressed this, and as I said, we'll talk about acid-base balance at this point in Module 3, so as we said, Nephron Future coming your way. I guess I really got way ahead of myself, so I don't think I need to say too much more here. All right, collecting duct. As I said, we're almost finished with our functional tour of duty through this nephron. And at the end of this thing, the collecting duct, as we said, it's that final concentration that's going on. But the other role is that acid-base balance. So even if you're not concerned about sodium and blood volumes, there's also the issue of equilibrium as far as acid-base in your body. And, if those kidneys need to be contributing to compensate for some kind of disequilibrium or imbalance of acid base, this is the site where it's occurring. So that late DC and collecting duct is the site of your quote-unquote renal compensation. But collecting duct function, as I said, the concentration, would like you to be familiar, and I'm not sure I did do this, so I'm guessing this is the outline in your notes. The only thing I'm asking you is if you remotely go through the process, just kind of memorizing the numbers in terms of it'll just reinforce the function all the way through. So what I'd like you to just be familiar is if you just walk through the concentration pathway that goes on all the way out to eventually renal papilla and into the minor calyces, you should be good to go. So we already chatted about, comes into descending limb and those kind of numbers of about 300-ish. By the time it gets downstairs, you see these big numbers, 1,200. This, artist rendition is 14. You get the idea. But as you go up, this ascending limb, water has to stay in there. You pull out sodium, so you dilute, dilute, dilute. And the key is by the time it's getting up into this early DCT, it's more dilute than it came in the loop of Henle to begin with. And then finally, as it ends at collecting duct and late DCT, that's the final stage. So depending on ADH, depending on aldosterone, determines what's going on as far as concentration, and obviously how much sodium is pulling back and how much fluid permeability there is. So just be able to walk through the variations of how that concentration fluctuates functionally through the nephron is really the take-home message there. So I don't think there's anything else I need to chat about other than just what we had said earlier in the very beginning of all this is, for the most part, you're throwing a whole lot of fluid in there and pulling back a good 99% of it and coming up with that, 1.5 liters a day of urine output. Okay, this is just a nice summary for you. I think what I've done is just give you the numbers, and so it's reinforcing what I'm asking you to do for this nephron. Follow the pathway of sodium through it and recognize the mechanisms at each stage and the volumes at each stage, and I think you'll be good to go with wrapping your head around the nephron. Then just attach the mechanism or site of action as far as the diuretic, and you're good to go. So I don't think I need to handhold through the little summary, but that's the intention for it. Potassium, we didn't talk too much about it, other than a similar pattern of majority of it, PCT. So it follows a similar discussion as far as reabsorption and as sodium does. Same thing of loop of Henle. So you've got a similar pattern to the end. And really, it's all in that late DCT, and that whole issue we discussed with the potassium secretion is where you're determining how much is coming in and not going out. But what I'd like to just point out, the only thing that is different, that this looks DDX between sodium and potassium, is in this early DCT, there's no reabsorption as far as potassium goes. So that's the extent of our discussion there. Calcium, not too much to chat about, other than it's kind of always in the background of, yeah, you're worried about sodium, potassium, calcium values in the bloodstream, as far as, your internal medicine, if you will. But the real caveat is through this nephron, calcium is always kind of the second cousin waiting to get into the game here or whatever. It's always just dependent on the gradients that are going on with those active mechanisms of sodium in front of it. But in simplistic terms, PCT, ascending loop, a majority of the sodium, and then in the DCT is kind of your final values, if you will. So not really dissecting the calcium process too much other than a generic statement. I have no idea. Do your notes match everything that's up here? This is probably a Post-it note to myself that's been there 3 years, and I actually did change the note, so I'll have to get rid of it. Urea didn't really want to talk, as I said, he didn't get in the nuts and bolts. Some of you may have done that whole counter concentration that goes on with the loop of Henle and the vasa recta. I don't think it really warrants, time-wise, all that much discussion, other than, as I said, a majority or a half of it winds up going through PCT, as we said earlier, and then after that, you're talking the end of the nephron for the whole issue of fine-tuning concentration and essentially making sure the interstitial space in that medulla is appropriate to do its job of concentrating and diluting the fluid as it goes through the loop of Henle. All right, so we made it. Hallelujah. 5 minutes to spare, so 5 extra minutes to study. Any questions, concerns, other than what's on your test at 1 o'clock? Worcester, good luck on your test. Manchester, good luck on your test. And have a nice, relaxed, wonderful, carefree weekend.